Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Everyone. And thanks to Gary, who's been working hard all day behind the glass doors there, recording and switching all the presentations. He's very efficient. And also thanks Sebastian and the other organisers for putting me on the agenda. And I know, I guess some of us like songs that end on a big bang, and some of us like songs that kind of fade out in a slightly melancholy kind of tone. So you can judge what the analogy will be in my talk today. I'm aware of the fact you've been here all day and you may be a bit tired and so on. And so so my talk is I'm going to say very little about algorithms and technology or anything like that, and talk more about some, I guess, feelings about how we might be able to expand the reach of machine learning into society. So outside the kind of people like most of those in the room who are experts of one kind or another, and to help machine learning have the impact it might have more broadly. So bring in a lot more people that currently don't use machine learning as part of their day-to-day lives, but might be interested in doing so if only we could somehow make that easier and more useful for them. And these thoughts have emerged after 8 years of work here at Microsoft Research in the group that I head, which is called Computational Ecology and Environmental Science. So we're not driven by an inherent interest in machine learning. Our inherent interest really is in the way that the natural world works. But we have a particular flavor of our group, which is to try to build predictive models of different aspects of the natural world. And so in doing so, we've naturally ended up doing a lot of machine learning of a particular flavor. And so there are some examples up here. I think I can get I guess one of these is going to give me a laser, right? Here we go. So this one on the left, for example, is some work that I did with my postdoc Mark van der Vel, trying to understand why it is that different species of trees adopt different distributions against the climate. You find some in the north and some in the south and so on. How can we understand why that is? And I've got a little demo to show you in a second of that. This is some work looking at ecological food webs. So can we somehow understand and predict which species will eat which other species? So is it just a completely idiosyncratic free-for-all? Or in fact, in our model, we claim that if you can place the species on a line, and so each species sits somewhere on the line and eats from somewhere else on the line, and that very simple kind of dimensional collapse down onto that low-dimensional system enables you to have a high predictive power of which species will eat other species. This is an example of a model that looks at how plants grow and develop. So each day the plant fixes a certain amount of carbon and invests carbon in leaves and roots, and one day it decides to flower and so on, and this eventually gives you a mass of seeds at the end. And we're looking at using that to try to understand the potential response of global agriculture to climate change. And some similar model to do with conservation. This is a model that describes the response of different kinds of birds to land use change. This is a simulation of a human process of taxonomic discovery. This is looking at the rate of discovery of new species around the world. We do know that most species have not yet been discovered. And this model describes the species discovery process in terms of a collision between the number of active taxonomists and the number of remaining species to be discovered, and then a trend in efficiency through time. And then this is a very ambitious model that my colleague Matthew Smith did, which is a model of the global carbon cycle. And so these models they vary a lot between different cases, but they in almost no cases do they correspond to any predefined model structure. These are things that we've tailored for the system of interest. But nonetheless, what we've learned to do over the years is fit these models to lots of data. Now, we rely on MCMC sampling. I'm sure some of you are familiar with that. It's a very broad, robust technique that allows you to pretty much fit any model to any data. And in fact, we have our own algorithm that we're very proud of called Fillsback, which we've tested very heavily. And so we just kind of throw these problems at Fillsback, and it's able to cope with these things. So we do I just want to point that out, that we do actually develop new algorithms for machine learning, and we enjoy doing that, and we're proud of them. But the topic of my talk today is really, after doing all of this, thinking, you can stress when you do these sorts of problems that what you're trying to do is get to the prediction at the end, that you're trying to go through the data, get the data, push it through the model, and get to a prediction. Maybe, though, before we move on, I might just quickly show you this demo. It depends on Silverlight being installed on the presentation PC, and it looks like it is, which is good. So I'll just show you one more because, as I said, it's late in the day and it'll be some colourful pictures and so on. So this is a visualization that we built of the forest modelling results. And so what's happening here is that in these figures, what we'll see is how different rates, so things like growth and mortality and reproduction in different kinds of trees, in this case northern temperate hardwoods, varies in climate space. And this was a model fit against, I think, 1.5 million individual measurements of the growth and death and reproduction of individual trees across the United States. And then if you then project that onto the geography of the United States, you can see how that varies, and it varies for different groups. And what we're able to do then is start a simulation where we spread all the individual trees, so millions of virtual trees, everywhere in the United States, and then we're able to run, and we let them compete it out over about 500 years in this case, and we can see eventually where they settle down to, and we can compare the predictions of the model there to what we see in reality. And this is an independent prediction because the model was just fit against fine-grained, short-term observations of growth and mortality, but what emerges over hundreds of years in the simulation is this distribution which we compare with reality. And then we did some more experiments to show, for instance, that it was the increase in mortality as you went north that was the primary determinant of the northern limits of these southern species. So we get that kind of ecological insight out of the modelling. And one of the reasons I wanted to mention that is because when we look back then, although and I would totally say we've done this in our group a lot, we've tended to stress that end point of the machine learning in our particular domain, which is the ability to make these kinds of predictions. Because, for instance, we can then change the climate of the United States and predict how that might affect this biodiversity and the carbon in the forests. But when we really look back at what we as individuals, and I think the contributions of our papers have come from machine learning, it's really much richer than that. We've taken a whole load of different things away in terms of insight, in terms of understanding of the value of different data sources, and kind of eureka moments, and etc. So, for example, I think if we're in danger sometimes, and not that everyone thinks this way, of presenting things a little bit like this, which is that we just kind of throw data through a computer. It could be this is a Commodore 64, still my idea of the ideal computer. We throw data through a computer and we get numbers, and that somehow makes the world a better place. And this is kind of pipeline sort of mentality, really, that, at the end we get some kind of, and of course it's not just numbers, but it might just be, predictions of something which we then roll out. This kind of develop the model, train, and then deploy that, and in some way. So it's a very kind of engineering kind of situation. Now, of course, sometimes that's exactly what you want to do. If it's something that's controlling a production plant or automatically displaying adverts on the web, for example. But in reality, we're usually after a lot more than that from the process. Expanding on that a little bit, of course, we're not quite as naive, so we could think of having these predict and response data, and we train, and then we're able to then reapply that model to a much larger group of predict data, and that, again, somehow makes people happy. We have this idea that, alternatively, in unsupervised machine learning, we're just sort of discovering patterns like clumps or groups or a PCA or some analogy of that. And again, this somehow leads to people, the world being a better place and happy people. If we expand that a little bit more, we can think about, and this I'm putting this partly in to show that my group has definitely been guilty of exactly this view as well, which is this pipeline idea of data and hypotheses, Bayesian inference, because that's our chosen method. This gives us a refined set of hypotheses, parameter distributions for any remaining models, which you can then go on to make predictions with uncertainty. But we can at least complicate this a little bit by saying, actually, this model structure and parameter distribution here, and then feed back and say what kind of data would we like to take next. So it can give us an idea of the value of different forms of data. This is really crucial because, for example, at the moment we put up satellites for $300 million a time, and by and large, there is no kind of predefined idea exactly about how that leads to predictions of what we need. There is a reasonable instinct saying this is useful data, kind of, but there isn't really a precise idea. The same is true with the predictions here, of course. And then in some general way, these predictions will somehow, in our case, interact with society. We're often thinking about things like food security and climate change. That could be governments, could be companies, individuals somehow will make use of these predictions. And again, I think that as much as this is my diagram from previous talks, I think even this is just much too dry. People are going to what is really the potential impact of machine learning in society? And I think often it might be the kind of, for example, here you have at least the idea that the number of hypotheses is reduced. And so that's, to some extent, we've made a scientific discovery when we do that. We've ruled in and ruled out some hypotheses. And it's that kind of insight, that idea of getting insight from the process. And maybe in reality, it's those moments that are going to have the largest impact out there in the real world. I think the idea of this pipeline, for me, the two key ways that it's misleading are, one is that actually good machine learning doesn't really look like this. It's a much more, as you guys know, it's a much more interactive, creative process where you take data, visualize the data, think about the models, develop the models, train the models against the data, you look at the results, you might switch your data sources, and on it goes, right? And actually it's enjoyable. That's why we like to do it. And so this idea that it's misleading then to tell society that you can just throw data through pre-packaged algorithms to get something useful out. Most of the useful examples we have in reality don't work that way. And secondly, I think it's equally important, it's a really disempowering way of presenting machine learning to the world. It's actually saying, you, the non-machine learning person, you're an expert in your domain, you've worked really hard to get where you are, you know about the real world, you've got instincts and ideas, but you know what, we don't need you anymore because we've got the computer. And so it's not really going to draw in those people, in my mind, that don't do machine learning yet if we present it in this way. So I know it's a little bit of a long introduction. So what I want to quickly go through now is what I see as 6 key barriers to the adoption of machine learning in society that follow from us adopting this pipeline view. And don't get me wrong, there may be many people in the room that feel they don't adopt that view. So when I say we, I should say perhaps me and my colleagues more than anything. So the first barrier I see is actually getting data in the first place. So it's funny, you have this I and T, IT, and we concentrate so much on the T, but what about the I? Where are people supposed to get the information from? Usually we just assume that that's your job to go and get the data and transform that data into useful information. So we felt this in our group. We were doing a lot of work where we would have some kind of response data like tree growth, and we wanted to link it to climate and soils, but actually getting hold of that climate and soil information was really hard. Every time. It was such a huge amount of wasted effort. But it just doesn't seem a very interesting problem to a lot of people to supply lots of data and information. It's much more interesting to think about the algorithms and the technology. So it's as if we're all of us left in the dark, rediscovering the same data sets and working away, making the same transformations on those data sets as different people. And this is something that we've tried to do something about in our group. I just say of the 6 barriers, I think this is, I don't in any way want to suggest that we've overcome these 6 in our group. Absolutely not. But this is one that we have thought a little bit about. And so we built a service which sits on top of multiple data sets in this case. And if you want to know something, like I like the African monsoon example. And then we built a web explorer, which is what this is, on top of that back-end service. So we're saying, in this case, I'd like a grid over this part of the world. I'd like to know about precipitation. If I want to know what data sets are underneath there, I can have a look. And if I like them or don't like them, I can turn them on or off. But if I'm a normal person, I'm just saying, I just want your best guess at precipitation. Thank you very much. I could tell you something about time. So in this case, we could, for instance, go through 12 monthly time steps during the year. And this service then is going to go off, find all the data sets that could potentially fulfill my query. It's going to do all the interpolation and subsetting, etc., off those data sets. It's going to calculate uncertainty for each of those, and then it's going to take the least uncertain answer and stitch that back together and send it back to me so I get my answer. So I've just sidestepped enormous amounts of boring work just by sending off a single query to this service. It's always a bit nervous doing something live off a web service, so it usually works in reasonable time. Let's have a look. If not, I will... oh, here we are. And then so here's the result in this case, and then we've got a little explorer there, so you can go back and forth and just see how the monsoon rains change throughout the year in Africa, typically. And it just shows you that how much easier we could make it to get information and then be able to visually explore to make a judgment. Does that data look good? Is it at the right resolution? Et cetera, et cetera. So that's kind of barrier number 1 that we've thought a little bit about. Barrier number 2, I think, is enabling people to insert their human knowledge into the model. So that if I load, for instance, a neural network, it's very difficult for me to somehow adapt that neural network to represent what I think I already know about how the world works or how this particular area works. This is in Matthew's carbon model, for example, and this is a stock and flow model. And each step here is based on our reading about biology, and physiology and ecology and so on. So that's a very complicated example. This is something that very much reflects our domain knowledge, and that becomes the model that we use for the machine learning, not some predefined structure that was designed with computational efficiency in mind. But I think addressing this issue could be much simpler, even just helping people through the steps of choosing the right predictor variables and maybe loading priors in some way to say, I believe that this has a positive effect on this and this other thing has a negative effect on that. Or saying, I think that it's these two things together that somehow affect this. I don't know how, but I just really think it's both of those, and either alone wouldn't make any sense. So these kind of human statements, which is what you might get out of someone with some domain-specific knowledge, how at the moment can I, as a normal person, not a machine learning person, insert those into the model that I'm going to use in my machine learning? It'd be a really interesting kind of problem in interaction design and user experiences I think we could think about. Another one is, as we all know, there are a lot of pitfalls in machine learning. There's a lot of aspects of best practice. And in general, people like the people in this room understand what the best practice is. You understand the idea of overfitting, of correlated predictor variables, of extrapolating outside your training domain, all these other things, right? The need for independent testing and making sure that your various search algorithms have converged. There are loads of things like that. And so having those things kind of baked into again, into the systems that we use for machine learning, and in a way that normal people can understand. Maybe it would be through very human language. Be careful. Whatever you do, don't use this model to predict outside this range because you could get crazy results and make a terrible decision, and so on. I mean, in our we thought a little bit about this in the particular domains that we work in, but there's nothing here that I think is particularly surprising about the idea of splitting data and training and testing and so on. This is quite orthodox. What's more surprising is that things like that, splitting data sets and doing independent testing or n-fold cross-validation or what have you, typically doesn't come naturally baked into the tools that we use. It's something that most people program somehow themselves. They sometimes do, but it really should be something that's hard to avoid in the systems that we're using. But that's a very small technical thing. More broadly, we might be able to help people just to do reasonable things and to use their models in reasonable ways and use the data in reasonable ways, if we thought about it enough. Okay, great, that's great, thanks. So another one is how can we, so let's assume that we've gone and spun up some algorithm, we fit a model to data in some way. So how can we now enable human beings to extract understanding from that? As we all know, when we train one of these models, depending on the model, some models are easier and harder, but those things have now, in a sense, are some kind of summary of the data or summary of the influences and effects that are going on in that data. So how can we present that back to more normal human beings in a way that can really help their understanding? Like this is an example of the plant growth model, and we altered this model lots of times, fit it against different data of individual plants, and we eventually had this realization that the optimal time to flower as a plant was as its so-called peak nitrogen. So we start with a high nitrogen level, and the plant sucks it all up, and it goes to zero. Initially, it doesn't suck it up very quickly because the plant is too small, and at the end, it doesn't suck up the nitrogen very quickly because there's none left. And in between, there's a time that's what you call peak N, which is analogous to peak oil in humans. And that turns out to be the optimal time to flower. So after all that kind of effort of fitting models to data, actually you end up with this kind of aha moment. And I think, for example, in the world of business, I would imagine it's those aha moments that might, because they're the ones that often then lead you to a more radical solution. And it's kind of more, again, a bit more empowering, right? It's like, wow, I understand things a bit more. I'm doing some work at the moment on extending our food web models to protein-protein interactions, and we're looking at fitting different geometries to protein-protein interaction data sets. And so this is a spherical proximity model. The closer you are in the sphere, you're more likely to interact. This is a lock and key model. If my lock matches your key, we're more likely to interact. And what we're hoping is that being able to conclude between which of these geometries, and that's one of about 12, fit the data better and more consistent with the data, and then looking at how the proteins are arranged in that space might give us some understanding about how it is that signaling networks in biology are able to do such complex computation. But I think, again, for other people, it could be much simpler how we report to them. This is a tool called Maxent, which is used in ecology a lot, which I think is really interesting because the underlying statistics are relatively simple, but what's really interesting about the tool is the way it reports lots of useful information back to the user. So it gives them a list of predictor variables with a useful graphic here saying, that allows you to assess how important different variables are, and it even looks at the functional form, so you can see the effect of each variable on the output. So this is all kind of stuff that, you know, the people that use this tool really value. And actually, it's, once you've done the hard bit of actually fitting the model to data, it's just pretty easy to generate this stuff. It's just kind of legwork, but it's really useful. And then I've only got a minute left, so I'm going to be very quick. A couple of other points. So one is to think about realistically how machine learning might be used in society. There are going to be a lot of cost-benefit trade-offs, so that rather than looking at it a little bit dryly like that, what has the most predictive power in my model, I might be interested in both that, but also how much money does it cost to take that data? How risky is it? How difficult is it legally? So could we help users to generate a kind of cost-effective, optimal machine learning model, which may be very different from sort of statistical best model? We might have a model that's overfit, not in a technical sense, but simply because it requires data that costs too much money. It's overfit in that sense. And this is just to point out the huge annual expansion in the cost of computing worldwide and data storage, etc. And a lot of us are quite excited about things like the cloud. But if we keep going at this rate, then we're in danger of being in a world like Isaac Asimov imagined, when people were building this ever more sophisticated computer to answer this unknown great question. And at the end, it sucked up all the energy in the universe and just said, let there be light. You know, it was a singularity kind of moment. And it is quite humbling to think that none of our analyses are even close to a human brain yet, but the human brain runs on 15 watts. But anyway, so the point is that money and energy and et cetera and other considerations, could we naturally build that into a system to help people build cost-effective, sustainable machine learning? And then finally, and this is a very, very quick point, just to say that even at the end of that, if you end up with this information presented back to the user in the form of predictions, for example, it's far from simple how you can make reasonable decisions given the uncertain predictions of models. So for a couple of headlines from recently where they practically shut down New York, and then the storm didn't quite hit New York, and they got a lot of flack for that. And here's another one, which is every year the CDC and other people have to judge which flu vaccine to develop, which strain of flu is most likely. And this year they got it largely wrong, so the flu vaccine is pretty much ineffective this year. And so could we help people, I won't explain this, but develop solutions, for instance, that are robust to those sorts of uncertainties and to help people with their thinking. And there we are. It's my final point, just to say, I guess, the overall point of this, going back, is to get away from that pipeline and to think about humans, as we can see in this unbiased sample of humanity that was returned to me from an image search for humans earlier this afternoon. So let's just remember this lot when we're thinking about our algorithms. Thank you very much.